Leah Hayes had always felt more at home among the rolling green ridges of the Smokies than in the small Tennessee town where she was born. On the edge of August 20th, she decided to head out for a 3-day solo photography trip in the Deep Creek area, a place she called her refuge since childhood. She drove her dusty silver Subaru out of Townsend early in the morning, its trunk rattling with camping gear and camera lenses packed with the precision of someone who believed in preparation. The morning air was thick with the promise of late summer heat, and she hummed to the radio, her eyes flicking to the peaks rising in the distance like sentinels. She had been planning the trip for weeks, charting routes on old topographic maps spread out on her kitchen table, plotting sunrises and angles determined to capture what she called the real Smokies, not the postcard clichés tourists snapped at the overlook pullouts. Her father, Tom Hayes, had never been easy about these solo trips, but he had come to respect his daughter's stubbornness, even admire it, in moments when his fear eased. She had trained herself to be careful buying a Garmin InReach for emergency signals, learning weather patterns, and even volunteering with search and rescue, so she understood the terrain better than most. That morning before leaving, she sent him a quick text telling him she would check in each night, and he replied with a simple "Be safe, kiddo." They both knew what that short phrase really meant. It was a contract of trust between a father and daughter who had always found their peace in the same hills. Leah never broke her word. She always checked in. That was who she was. Responsible, methodical, a little too serious sometimes, but never reckless. The sun was setting on her first day when she stopped along a quiet bend of Deep Creek Trail. She set her tripod, carefully checking the angles, waiting for that magic golden light that turned the green of the canopy into a burnished cathedral. In the video she recorded to send to her father, she smiled into the camera, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her voice clear over the hush of water in the creek. She told him she was safe, that the campsite was good, and that the view was even better than she hoped. She ended with the words, "I am safe, I promise." That was the last time anyone heard her voice. The clip was sent, and Tom Hayes watched it on his porch back in Townsend as the first stars pricked through the twilight sky. He laughed quietly, feeling foolish for worrying so much, and closed his phone with relief. He had no idea that would be the last normal evening of his life. Deep in the woods, miles away, Leah sat at her small fire, warming her hands against the creeping chill of mountain nights. She had pitched her tent with its fly taut against dew, stowed her food in a bear canister well away from camp, and arranged her pack so it would be ready for a pre-dawn hike up to the ridge. Her gear was laid out with soldierly precision. She was not someone who forgot things or left chaos in her wake. Her Nikon DSLR was cleaned and ready, its spare battery charged and tucked in her side pocket. As darkness pressed against the firelight, she felt that familiar mix of fear and thrill that always came with solitude. She loved that tension. It reminded her she was alive. It was why she had come here alone. But on that particular night, something in the silence made her shiver in a way she could not quite explain. Other hikers camped farther down Deep Creek Trail would later recall hearing raised voices in the woods around dusk. 2 campers from Ohio told investigators they heard a heated exchange somewhere near the trail junction. A woman's voice, firm and insistent. A man's voice, low and angry, though they could not make out the words. They shrugged it off at the time, assuming it was a lover's quarrel, not wanting to interfere in what they imagined was private business. They packed up early the next morning and left without a second thought. It would only be days later that they realized the argument they heard might have been the last sound Leah Hayes ever made in this world. By then it was too late to be sure of anything, except that someone was angry, someone was scared, and the forest swallowed the rest. The next morning Leah did not check in. Tom waited until noon before convincing himself she might have lost signal. By dusk, he was pacing the porch, his coffee cold in his hand. He told himself the weather had been clear. The roads fine, no storms on the radar. Maybe she just lost track of time. Maybe she made friends at another campsite. But it was a lie he was telling himself, and he knew it. She never lost track. She never forgot. That was not Leah. By late evening, he tried the park ranger station, but they told him it was too soon to panic. Hikers often went dark for a night. Tom did not sleep at all. He sat in his chair by the window, staring at the ridgeline in the moonlight, whispering her name like a prayer. By dawn, he was on the road in his old Ford pickup driving toward the Smokies, with his heart in his throat. He did not wait for permission or procedure. He rallied her friends in Bryson City. He called anyone who would answer. He stopped in Cherokee for gas, his hands shaking as he keyed her number over and over again. Every call went to voicemail, her recorded voice telling him she could not answer now. He had listened to it so many times that by the time he parked at Deep Creek, the words felt like a knife in his chest. He sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, telling himself he would not cry yet. He needed to hold it together. For her. For whatever he might find. Then he climbed out, slammed the door, and walked toward the ranger station as the morning mist lifted slowly off the mountains that had always felt like home. He was determined not to leave without her. Tom Hayes reached the ranger station before most of the staff had even arrived, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor as he stood there, heart pounding. Ranger Caleb Barnes was the first to greet him, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw the desperation in Tom's eyes. Tom explained that Leah had failed to check in, that she was always careful, and that something felt wrong in his bones. Barnes listened carefully, nodding, but cautioned that official search procedures required a certain waiting period before declaring someone missing. Tom bristled at that, his voice rising with frustration as he insisted that Leah was not the kind of person to wander off without telling someone. The tension in the room was palpable, but Barnes finally agreed to do an informal sweep along the trailhead, while Tom called Leah's friends and started gathering volunteers in Bryson City to form their own search party. As dawn brightened over the Smokies, word spread quickly through town. Leah was well known and respected for her photography and environmental work, and the locals took it personally. Men and women packed old trucks with bottled water, first aid kits, and homemade sandwiches. They met at the general store and planned their approach using battered park maps spread across the tailgates. By the time Sheriff Brenda Morales arrived, the volunteers were already heading out on foot. She called Tom aside, trying to calm him, and explained that an official search had to follow specific protocols. But she recognized the fear in his eyes and chose to let the volunteers keep looking while she and her deputies coordinated with the Park Service. The road into the park had been partially flooded overnight by the storm slowing their arrival. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Meanwhile, the searchers hiked through the damp hush of the forest, their boots sucking at the muddy ground as they spread out in pairs, calling Leah's name over and over. The trees loomed close with dripping branches, the scent of wet earth and moss filling the air. Around mid-morning, they found Leah's campsite tucked neatly against a gentle slope above the creek. It was untouched, eerily so, with the tent pitched cleanly, her sleeping bag unrolled inside, and her bear canister untouched a safe distance away. What struck them most was the complete absence of disarray. It looked as if she had just stepped away for a moment, except that her camera was nowhere to be found. Sheriff Morales studied the site with a grim frown, noting every detail carefully. She directed her deputy Eric Shaw to photograph everything then to secure the area in case it became a crime scene. As they examined the area, one of the volunteers found Leah's map discarded behind a fallen log. It was soaked and muddy, but still legible in places. Sheriff Morales held it up, seeing that one corner had been carefully torn off, the missing piece conspicuous in its absence. She tucked it into an evidence bag, while Tom stood nearby, shaking his head in disbelief. He walked through the campsite, slowly taking in the untouched food, the carefully folded clothes, the empty spot where her DSLR had always rested next to her pack. He reached down and picked up one of her old water bottles, turning it in his calloused hands, as if it might tell him anything about where she had gone. But there was no answer, just the quiet gurgle of the creek and the muted hush of wind through wet leaves. Sheriff Morales gathered the volunteers before they went any deeper. She reminded them to be cautious, to stay in pairs, and to mark any evidence with the bright tape they had distributed. She looked at Tom and told him gently that this had to be treated as both a missing person case and a potential crime scene now. Tom simply nodded his jaw, set his eyes red. He turned and called for another sweep, insisting they fan out toward the trail junction where she was last seen. The volunteers obeyed without question. They were his friends and neighbors, people who had watched Leah grow up, people who knew what it meant to be from these hills. They did not need a reason to help him. They just did it because it was the right thing to do. As dusk approached, the search parties returned. Slowly, their clothes wet and stained with mud, their voices hushed. They reported nothing new. No sign of her footprints, no dropped gear, no sound or sight that could point to her. Morales and Barnes exchanged a long look as they logged the results and prepared to meet with the National Park Service to request an official search and rescue deployment. Meanwhile, Tom sat on the edge of Leah's tent platform, staring at the ground, refusing to leave as the evening chill settled in. Deputy Shaw knelt next to him, quietly offering a thermos of coffee that Tom took without speaking. He sipped it slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire ring where Leah's last embers had long gone cold. Deputy Eric Shaw arrived at the site before dawn the next morning, his boots crunching on the stiff, damp ground as he surveyed the campsite one more time. He could see where the volunteers had trampled the soil in their rush the day before, but the main area remained eerily untouched. The smell of wet earth and rotting leaves clung to the air, and he paused to listen, hoping for any sound that might break the oppressive quiet. Sheriff Morales and Ranger Caleb Barnes joined him shortly after carrying their packs and wearing the tired expressions of people who had slept in short bursts in the cabs of their trucks. They greeted him quietly before getting to work. They had to retrace every inch of trail around the site and see if the rains had revealed anything new overnight. Tom Hayes refused to stay in town. He insisted on joining them again, wearing the same clothes as the day before, his eyes bloodshot but steady with determination that would not waver. The team spread out methodically, marking their path with bright orange tape as they moved through the dense underbrush. It was slow work, with slick mud pulling at their boots and brambles tearing at their clothes. The K-9 unit arrived mid-morning, a wiry brown bloodhound named Dixie, whose nose was her reputation. Deputy Shaw watched as her handler gave her Leah's old t-shirt to sniff. Dixie circled twice, whined, and then bounded off in the direction of the main trail that led toward the road to Cherokee, North Carolina. They followed quickly, pushing through brush and over wet roots, trying to keep pace. For a half hour, the dog was single-minded, pulling hard on the leash as she navigated switchbacks and low creek beds swollen from the storm. But then she stopped suddenly. She turned in a slow circle, nose to the ground, and sat down with a low, uncertain sound. The trail was gone. Confused, the handler tried again, letting Dixie sniff the shirt one more time. She cast about, picking up a scent, only to turn back toward the road. The team exchanged wary glances. Sheriff Morales took out her map, tracing the looping path the dog had marked, realizing it circled back toward the main road, instead of going deeper into the woods where Leah had planned to hike. It made no sense unless she had decided to turn back, or had been forced that way. Tom Hayes clenched his fists at his sides as he watched. He demanded they keep going, but Morales shook her head. She reminded him that the dog had lost the scent, and that pushing blindly risked missing clues. She ordered the team to regroup, despite his angry protests. As they assembled back at the site, Ranger Caleb Barnes noticed something that chilled him. Along the path about 200 yards from Leah's tent, dark spots speckled the damp pine needles. He squatted down carefully, using a stick to lift the needles and exposing the rich red-brown underneath. Sheriff Morales came to his side immediately, her face set and grim. It was blood unmistakable, even diluted by the rain. They marked the spot and carefully photographed it, their radios crackling with requests for supplies to secure the area. Tom saw it too, and for the first time in 2 days, he staggered slightly as if the weight of hope was finally breaking him. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand and turned away, refusing to let anyone see him falter for long. Deputy Shaw tried to lighten the moment by suggesting maybe it was animal blood, maybe a deer injured during the storm. But no one really believed it. The droplets led a short way before disappearing entirely the rain, having erased whatever trail there might have been beyond those first telling marks. The discovery changed everything. Sheriff Morales radioed for additional resources, instructing them to approach carefully to avoid destroying evidence. She also contacted the state police for forensic support. They needed to know if it was human blood and whose it was. As they waited, the volunteers were ordered back to town for their safety and to prevent contaminating the scene. Tom protested again, but eventually relented when Barnes put a hand on his shoulder and quietly told him this was now officially a crime scene. Throughout the afternoon, the investigators worked quietly, marking the area, setting up tape and evidence flags, documenting every angle with cameras. The forest seemed to lean in around them, dark and wet and unwelcoming. A hush settled over the searchers that was not just respect for the missing woman, but the grim realization that the story was no longer one of a lost hiker. Sheriff Morales called a meeting at dusk with the remaining search leaders. She explained in a low voice that they could no longer treat this as a simple disappearance. They had to consider that Leah might have been taken against her will or hurt by someone she trusted. Tom listened, his expression carved in stone, every word deepening the crease in his brow. He insisted that they continue to search the area, even if it meant breaking into smaller groups. But Morales shook her head. She said they could not risk destroying what little evidence they had. Tom argued until his voice broke, but finally he dropped onto a stump and put his head in his hands. No one spoke for a long while after that. They just watched the fog begin to roll through the hollows of the Smokies, swallowing the fading light and making the woods seem even more endless and cruel. Deputy Shaw put a hand on Tom's shoulder and told him they would not stop, that they would not let her go without a fight. But the words felt hollow in the heavy, wet silence. The morning after the blood was found, the Smokies wore an oppressive hush that settled over the ridges and hollows like a heavy blanket. Sheriff Morales arrived early at the command post they had set up near Deep Creek, reviewing maps spread over the hood of her cruiser with Ranger Caleb Barnes and Deputy Shaw. Rain from the night before had washed away most of the scent trails, turning the narrow game paths into slick ribbons of mud. Volunteers stood around sipping burnt coffee from paper cups, whispering in subdued voices, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Tom Hayes sat alone on a folding chair, gripping the edge with both hands, staring at nothing. His mind replayed the search over and over, every failure cutting deeper than the last. He refused to leave the site. He told Morales quietly that he would not go home without her, no matter what it took. The search teams gathered in small groups ready to redeploy, but the plan had changed. Morales insisted they focus on grid searches downstream. The storm had been fierce, and the creeks had risen quickly before receding just as fast. It had become clear that the floodwaters might have carried away anything Leah had dropped or discarded. Barnes explained that the surge could have scattered belongings miles downstream, and they needed to check debris piles and banks carefully. As they pushed into the soaked undergrowth, their boots squelched with every step. The air smelled of wet leaves and churned earth, and every branch they parted seemed to send a fresh spray of rainwater onto their faces. Despite the dreary weather, the teams pressed forward with stubborn determination, calling Leah's name into the wind, even though they all knew there would be no answer. By late morning, a shout echoed from the far bank of the creek. Deputy Shaw ran toward the noise with Barnes on his heels. They found 2 volunteers standing over a twisted mess of branches and silt that had caught against a fallen log. Poking out of the debris was a torn backpack, the bright color of its nylon fabric dulled by mud and grime. Shaw felt his stomach turn as he recognized the style from the photos Leah's father had shared. They pulled it free carefully, setting it on a plastic tarp to examine it. The straps were shredded in places, and the zipper was half open, revealing a soggy mess of clothes and personal items inside. They spread the contents with gloved hands, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. The backpack contained damp clothes, a battered first aid kit, and a small notebook swollen with water damage, its pages illegible. But it was the last item that stopped them cold. At the bottom of the pack, caked in mud, was a man's wristwatch. Barnes picked it up and turned it over in his gloved palm, frowning at the worn leather band and cracked face. It seemed so out of place among Leah's belongings, a masculine detail that made no sense. He called Morales over, who examined it closely, and then dropped it into an evidence bag. When Tom Hayes arrived minutes later, his eyes fell on the watch immediately. He went pale, his mouth opening without sound for a moment before he managed to whisper that he recognized it. Leah had photographed that watch once for her blog, laughing at the idea of finding it abandoned in the woods. He remembered teasing her about it, asking who just leaves stuff like that out here. Tom turned away, as if struck, walking to the edge of the creek and pressing his fists to his forehead. The memory twisted in his chest like a blade. Morales put a hand on his shoulder but did not try to speak. She knew there was nothing she could say that would help. Barnes crouched by the tarp, staring at the pack, his mind working through the possibilities. Maybe Leah had picked up the watch as a curiosity. Maybe she planned to photograph it again, but that seemed wrong somehow. It felt planted. It felt like a message or a mistake left by someone who had not thought things through. The silence among the searchers was deep and troubled. No one wanted to give voice to the thoughts they all shared. They finished cataloging the items and radioed for transport back to the command post. As they walked, the clouds pressed low and dark over the ridges, threatening more rain. The forest seemed to close in around them, heavy with the weight of secrets. The volunteers carried the tarp between them, carefully avoiding roots and slick stones, their eyes trained on their footing, but their minds miles away. When they reached the vehicles, Morales told them to stand back as she loaded the evidence into her cruiser. She turned to Tom and told him gently but firmly that he should go back to town, get some food, and rest. He shook his head once and leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, waiting for the next move. At the command post, they laid everything out again under the harsh light of portable lamps. The watch was photographed from every angle, its scratches and stains recorded carefully. Barnes made notes about the flood damage, observing how certain items had been packed so tightly that even the rushing water had not fully dislodged them. They debated quietly whether the pack had been torn before or during its violent journey downstream. The argument felt academic in the face of the truth. Leah was missing. Blood had been found. Now her pack was here, miles away from her last known camp, deposited like an accusation in the debris of a flooded creek. Tom sat through it all silent, except for the occasional hitch in his breath. He listened as Morales explained that the pack could have traveled a long way in the floodwaters, meaning the actual site of any struggle or abduction might be far upstream or even on a tributary. It was not a lead that narrowed anything. It only deepened the mystery. When they finally paused for the night, Tom refused a cot in the station. He sat outside on a camp chair, watching the glow of headlamps as the searchers returned in twos and threes. The wind picked up in the trees overhead, carrying with it the promise of another wet, restless night in the Smokies. The morning sun broke through low clouds as Tom Hayes drove slowly into Cherokee, North Carolina. He barely noticed the quiet charm of the town with its low-slung shops and fading murals, his mind fixed on the backpack and the wristwatch found in the flood debris. Sheriff Morales had told him to take a break to rest and clear his head, but he could not bear to sit still. Instead, he parked outside a diner where the search teams often grabbed coffee and waited for news. He walked in with stiff legs and sat heavily at the counter. The waitress nodded to him with weary recognition, filling his cup without asking. Tom did not look at the menu. He just held the cup in both hands, watching the steam curl up into the stale morning air. He felt the weight of each minute pressing down on him heavier, with every second Leah remained lost. Sheriff Morales spent the early hours coordinating with deputies and rangers, directing new search grids further upstream. She divided teams into small groups with strict instructions to document anything they found. Meanwhile, Deputy Shaw was dispatched into town with instructions to follow up on a vague report that had trickled in through local chatter. At a small bar on the edge of Cherokee, the bartender remembered seeing Leah 2 days before her trip arguing with a man in the back parking lot. The bartender hesitated at first, but Shaw pressed gently, promising discretion. The bartender finally described the man as lean-bearded and wearing a faded work jacket. He seemed tense, leaning in close to Leah while she pushed him back. Shaw scribbled details into his notebook, nodding grimly. Back at the sheriff's office, Morales listened carefully as Shaw relayed the conversation over the phone. The description matched someone she knew by reputation. Mason Holt, a local who had once dated Leah briefly years ago before things had ended badly. He had moved to Georgia, but was known to drift back into town every so often. Morales remembered the old reports of shouting matches and angry calls to deputies, though Leah had never filed charges. Morales felt her stomach tighten as she asked Shaw to confirm any known addresses or recent sightings of Holt. She had to consider the possibility that he had come back, and that old tensions had flared in private before exploding in the woods. As the investigation continued, rumors spread through town like wildfire. At the diner, old men with coffee-stained shirts debated whether Leah had run away, had an accident, or met someone dangerous in the woods. Mothers hushed their children as they walked past the bulletin board where Leah's missing poster had been pinned front and center. Teenagers scrolled their phones, sharing theories about who might have hurt her. The entire community seemed to hold its breath, watching the ridgelines for any sign of movement, any hope of her safe return. Tom heard every whispered word, every passing remark, and it burned like salt in an open wound. He wanted to shout that Leah would never just leave without telling him. She was not reckless. She did not run from trouble. Deputy Shaw worked the phones relentlessly, chasing down old leads on Mason Holt. He found a prior restraining order filed in Georgia after Holt had been accused of threatening a girlfriend. The details were ugly and undeniable. Holt had a history of violence and a reputation for grudges. Morales sat at her desk reading the report line by line, her fingers tapping the wood as she thought. When she called Georgia law enforcement for more information, they confirmed that Holt had no active warrants but was known to vanish for months at a time doing construction work under the table. It was a paper trail full of gaps and blind spots that gave her no comfort at all. She closed the file and exhaled slowly, feeling the heavy responsibility settle onto her shoulders. Sheriff Morales called Tom Hayes into her office that afternoon, inviting him to sit across from her at the small, cluttered desk. She laid out what they knew carefully, watching his face tighten with each new piece of evidence. She told him about the bartender's report, the restraining order, the fact that Mason Holt had no solid alibi for the days around Leah's departure. Tom listened in silence, his jaw working. When Morales paused, he finally asked the question they had both been avoiding. Did she think Holt did it? Morales hesitated before answering, saying she had to follow the evidence wherever it led. She promised Tom that she would not stop digging until they found Leah, no matter how painful the truth turned out to be. Tom left the office without another word, climbing into his truck and gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He felt betrayal and rage in equal measure, remembering Mason Holt's easy smile the first time he had come by the house, how Leah had brushed off his worries by saying she could handle herself. Tom's mind churned through every old argument, every door slammed in frustration, every moment he had told himself to back off and trust his daughter to make her own choices. Now he sat alone in the fading light, wondering if he had failed her by not pushing harder, by not seeing the danger that had been right in front of them. As the day ended, Morales reviewed her notes one more time before heading home. She thought about Tom Hayes, sitting in the dark of his driveway, unwilling to leave the search even when the sun dipped below the tree line. She thought about Leah's smile in the photos her father had given them, about the future that had been stolen. She felt a cold anger build in her chest. She picked up her phone and made one more call, instructing Shaw to keep checking every lead on Holt. She told him not to rest until they found him, no matter where he had gone. She would not allow Leah's story to fade into another sad mystery that locals told in hushed voices over campfires. The search effort moved into its second week with new urgency and new tension that weighed on everyone who wore a badge or carried a volunteer radio. Sheriff Morales sat with Ranger Caleb Barnes over lukewarm coffee at the command post just after dawn. They pored over a map that had grown ragged at the edges, its surface crisscrossed with highlighter lines, marking every trail ridge and creek bed they had searched so far. Barnes traced a finger along the Noland Divide trail, suggesting they check the old, hollowed trees that sometimes acted as natural caches for lost or stashed items. Morales agreed, seeing the logic in checking places that might have been overlooked in the early rush. She gave him the go-ahead and told him to take Deputy Shaw along if he needed the backup. Barnes shook his head and said he preferred to move quiet and slow alone, so he could listen to the woods in the way only a ranger could. The morning was thick with the kind of fog that clung to the skin and dampened every sound. Barnes parked at a lonely trailhead and began to hike, boots scuffing on roots and rocks, his pack creaking with every careful step. He had worked these mountains for years and knew the subtle signs that told him when something was off. A broken branch at a strange angle. A patch of ground disturbed in a way only a boot could do. As he walked, he paused, often listening to the bird song and the distant hush of water, hoping for any sound that might be human. Hours passed like that, slow and steady, until he came to an old tree near a switchback. The trunk had split years ago, leaving a natural hollow that locals sometimes used to stash gear or keep things dry in sudden storms. Barnes knelt carefully and shone his flashlight inside the hollow. He felt his breath catch. There was something tucked back in the darkness, half hidden under old leaves and dirt. He reached in and pulled it free, blinking at the familiar shape of an SD card container. He turned it over in his gloved hand, heart beating faster. This was no animal den or random trash. Someone had put it here deliberately. He stood slowly scanning the trees around him for any movement, any glint of a lens, or a shadow that did not belong. Seeing nothing, he slipped the card into an evidence bag and radioed Morales with a calm voice that did not betray the cold realization settling in his bones. Morales arrived 2 hours later. Mud streaked on her uniform, eyes hard but focused. She met Barnes at the trailhead, where he had waited without moving, sitting on a fallen log like a sentry. He handed her the evidence bag without a word. She held it up to the light and felt the weight of what it might contain. They drove back to the command fund in silence, the tires spitting gravel behind them, neither speaking as the realization of what they might see on that card sat between them like a third passenger. When they arrived, Morales had the deputy secure the door and cover the windows. They powered up a battered old laptop and slid the card into the reader, bracing themselves. The first image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel. It was a landscape shot, the blue-green sweep of the Smokies at dusk. Morales let out a breath she did not know she was holding. Then another image followed. Leah's face in profile, lit by the last orange light of the day, eyes focused on something unseen. Barnes leaned forward, eyes narrowing. More images scrolled by, some blurry, some heartbreakingly perfect in their composition. They were the work of someone who loved the mountains enough to get every angle right. Then the mood changed. The images grew darker, grainier. Leah walking along a trail at dusk, her silhouette framed against the sky. Behind her, deep in shadow, was a shape that made Morales's blood run cold. It was a person in camouflage, barely visible, but undeniably there. The figure was turned slightly toward Leah, caught in motion, a pale oval of a face just clear enough to show a beard and a cap. Barnes swore softly, leaning back in his chair. They zoomed in, but the image began to pixelate badly. Morales closed her eyes for a moment before saving the image to the desktop. She called Shaw in and told him to look carefully. Shaw paled as he recognized the blurry lines of the old Klingman's Dome fire tower behind Leah, its rusted rails and skeletal frame, unmistakable even in shadow. It was a landmark they had not thoroughly searched, yet considered too remote and ruined for camping. Morales straightened her shoulders and began issuing orders. She told Barnes to take the best people and check the tower at first light. She asked Shaw to run every name they had with military service records or hunting licenses that matched the man in the photo. She called Tom Hayes and told him as gently as she could that they had found new evidence that they had proof Leah was not alone out there in those last moments. Tom listened quietly, voice cracking just once as he thanked her. When he hung up, he sat in his kitchen staring at the worn linoleum floor, gripping the receiver until his knuckles turned white. He told himself he would go with them the next day, no matter what Morales said. He would not be left behind. As night fell on the command post, Morales sat alone at her desk, the blurry photo of Leah and the figure in camo displayed on the screen before her. She felt a cold anger rise in her chest. She printed out the image and pinned it to the evidence board under the words, "Person of Interest." She underlined it twice in thick black ink. Then she sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples, trying to push away the thought of Leah's smile in those first photos. The storm outside rattled the window panes, wind howling through the dark trees, but Morales refused to look away from the evidence. She told herself that no matter how bad it got, they would not give up on finding the truth. The next morning arrived with a dull gray sky hanging low over the Smokies. The rain had eased, but left the world slick and heavy with the smell of wet pine and damp earth. Ranger Caleb Barnes led the small team up the winding path toward Klingman's dome fire tower. Each step was careful and deliberate, as the trail was littered with rocks made treacherous by moss and runoff. Deputy Shaw walked a few paces behind, scanning the woods with sharp eyes that refused to rest. They had seen the blurry figure in camouflage on Leah's SD card. That knowledge pressed on them like a physical weight as they hiked. The others were silent, each caught in thoughts of what they might find, hoping for clues, but dreading what truth they might reveal in the old skeletal frame of the fire tower. As they neared the base, the tower came into view, a black shape against the washed-out sky. Rust streaked the metal legs and wind rattled the loose railings like brittle bones. Barnes signaled for them to slow, and they approached with wary eyes, checking every shadow and overgrown patch around the base. Ivy had climbed partway up the supports, thick and tangled, offering too many places for something or someone to hide. Shaw moved to the north side, his flashlight sweeping over old carvings and graffiti left by years of campers and local teenagers. Barnes climbed the first few steps, the metal creaking beneath his weight. He paused to listen, but heard only the wind moaning through the trees. Halfway up, he stopped. Something fluttered in the wind. He squinted and saw a boot hanging from a rusted nail hammered into one of the crossbeams. It was caked with mud, the laces dangling unmistakably, a woman's hiking boot of the same make and color Leah had worn in every photo. Barnes called down quietly for Shaw, who quickly climbed to meet him. Together, they examined the boot without touching it, noting the scuffs and tears, the way the mud had dried into cracked plates on the leather. Shaw's voice was tight as he spoke, saying Leah's name softly under his breath. Barnes swallowed hard, then signaled to bag it carefully. They both knew it was no accident. Someone had placed it there deliberately, like a trophy or a message, a cruel marker of ownership in this lonely height above the forest. They climbed further to the platform, their boots thumping on the warped wood. The view spread out below them in ghostly layers of mist and rolling ridges. It would have been beautiful, if not for the dark purpose that had brought them there. Barnes scanned the floorboards with slow precision. His flashlight caught something dark wedged between two slats. He crouched and pried up a rotted board, the smell of mildew filling the air. Shaw watched tensely as Barnes reached in and lifted out a piece of blackened, partially burned fabric. He held it up and turned it in the beam of the light. It was a piece of jacket, the familiar bright teal trim scorched and ragged. Shaw felt bile rise in his throat as he recognized it from Leah's photos. Nearby, someone had carved initials into the old wood with a knife. The letters were clear, despite the weathering. M.H. Sheriff Morales had warned them about Mason Holt, and now his mark was here, seared into the evidence, as if daring them to understand what he had done. Barnes felt his jaw clench so hard it hurt. Shaw took photos from every angle, the flash stark in the gloom casting jagged shadows against the battered walls. They bagged the charred fabric carefully, avoiding contamination, their gloves slick with cold sweat. Neither spoke much, their thoughts grim and settled like stones in their stomachs. By the time they descended, the wind had picked up whipping stray raindrops against their faces. The rest of the team gathered at the base, their eyes somber, as Barnes held up the evidence bags. There was no celebration of progress, no relief in finding anything. Only the raw awareness that Leah had been here, that someone had taken the time to mock her, to leave pieces of her behind like warnings. The hike back was quiet, the only sound the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional crack of branches underfoot. Shaw walked beside Barnes without speaking, their shoulders hunched against the chill. When they returned to the command post, Sheriff Morales waited for them. She took one look at the boot and the scorched jacket piece and said nothing for a long moment. Then she nodded and instructed them to lay everything out on the table. Tom Hayes was there too, refusing once again to be sent away. He stood over the evidence, his face pale and drawn. His fingers trembled as he reached toward the boot before stopping himself, pulling his hand back as if burned. Morales met his eyes and told him they would bring Mason Holt in. Tom only nodded once, his mouth pressed in a line, his eyes bright with grief and rage that had no outlet. The team worked late into the night, documenting everything. They labeled evidence bags, filled out chain of custody forms, and updated the caseboard with new photos. The initials carved into the fire tower loomed large in their minds, an accusation and a promise of confrontation. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest again, drumming on the metal roof of the command post like a slow funeral march. Volunteers huddled under tarps, watching the dark forest with haunted eyes. No one spoke of hope anymore. They spoke of justice and truth, whatever it cost to find it. The arrest of Mason Holt came swiftly, with flashing lights and the heavy presence of deputies who had no intention of giving him a chance to run. Sheriff Morales led the operation herself, standing outside the small cabin Holt had been renting on the edge of Cherokee. The damp fog clung to the yard as the team approached, quietly, weapons at low ready. When Holt opened the door, bleary-eyed and unshaven, he seemed startled but not surprised. Morales spoke in a calm but firm voice, telling him he was under arrest for questioning in connection to Leah Hayes' disappearance. He did not resist. He simply raised his hand slowly and let them cuff him while the deputies patted him down and led him to the waiting car. Inside the small sheriff's office interview room, the air felt heavy and close. Holt sat slumped in a metal chair, wrists cuffed to a chain bolted to the table. Morales entered with Deputy Shaw, dropping the evidence photos onto the table one by one. The boot hanging in the fire tower, the charred jacket piece, the initials carved into the wood. Holt watched them without blinking at first, but his eyes twitched when he saw the carved letters. Morales leaned in, her voice low and controlled, demanding answers. Holt began to talk, his words halting and uneven. He admitted to meeting Leah before she left, admitted to arguing about their past, but insisted he had not followed her into the woods. He swore he left for Georgia the next day, offering no proof, no receipts, no witnesses. Morales pressed harder, showing him the initials carved into the tower. Holt's face twitched again, anger flashing across his features. He claimed he did not remember carving anything, that it could have been years old. He said lots of people carved initials there. Shaw asked about the burned jacket fragment. Holt sat silent, then his mouth-tight jaw working as if grinding something bitter between his teeth. He eventually snapped that if they were going to blame him for everything, they might as well charge him now. Morales sat back in her chair, studying him carefully, noting the way his leg bounced under the table, the sweat gathering at his hairline despite the chill in the room. Outside the door, Tom Hayes sat on a plastic chair in the hall, staring at the floor. He could hear the muffled rise and fall of voices inside. His fists rested on his knees, knuckles white. He wanted to rip the door open and demand the truth from Holt himself. Deputy Shaw finally stepped out, closing the door behind him, and shaking his head slowly. He told Tom they were trying, but Holt was not giving them anything solid. Tom's voice cracked as he asked if that man had killed his daughter. Shaw did not answer. He only rested a hand on Tom's shoulder and promised they were not done yet. As the day stretched into evening, Morales made the call to transfer Holt to the county jail. They had enough to hold him on obstruction and violation of a previous protective order, but not yet enough to charge him with murder or kidnapping. She sat at her desk long after the others left, flipping through the interview transcript and scribbling notes in the margins. Her frustration felt like a stone in her stomach. The evidence was circumstantial. The initials, the argument, the violent history. But the law required more than suspicion, more than gut certainty. She needed hard proof, or a confession that held up in court not one rung from a man pushed past his breaking point. While Holt sat in a cell under harsh fluorescent lights, another call crackled over the sheriff's office radio. It was from Asheville, North Carolina, about an hour east. A pawnshop owner had reported a man trying to sell a high-end DSLR camera matching the make and model described in Leah Hayes' missing property report. Morales felt her pulse jump as she grabbed the radio, barking instructions to hold the camera and stall the seller if possible. Deputies coordinated with Asheville PD and confirmed the camera's serial number matched Leah's exactly. Morales felt hope flare for the first time in days. But then the report added a gut-wrenching twist. The seller was not Mason Holt. He was a drifter known locally for petty theft drug charges and vagrancy. The man had no fixed address and had been living out of abandoned houses along the Blue Ridge corridor. Morales ordered him picked up and brought in for questioning. When he arrived dirty and thin, he looked beaten down by years of hard living. Morales sat across from him, photos of Leah and the camera on the table. She spoke quietly, warning him that lying would only make things worse. The man trembled as he spoke, eyes flicking everywhere but at the sheriff. He said he found the camera in the woods weeks before. He claimed he thought it was lost, that no one would miss it, that he needed the money. When pressed, he finally broke down. Tears streaked the grime on his cheeks as he described the moment he found it. He had seen blood on the leaves nearby. He admitted to seeing a woman lying in the underbrush, unmoving. He panicked, ran away, and did not call for help because he had outstanding warrants and feared going to prison. Morales felt her heart sink as she listened. He was not the killer. He was a coward who left Leah to die alone. His confession was worthless for solving the crime, but revealed a terrible truth. Leah had been alive long enough to be seen abandoned by someone who could have saved her. Tom Hayes heard about the new suspect and rushed to the office, hope surging and dying in the same breath. Morales told him gently what the drifter had said. Tom sagged against the wall, shaking his head, eyes squeezed shut to hold back tears. The weight of knowing his daughter might have been saved if someone had just done the right thing crushed him. The deputies turned away, giving him the dignity of silence. Outside the office, the wind howled down the narrow streets of town, rattling signs and whistling through empty alleys like a cold promise that the worst was not yet over. The dawn after the confession felt colder than any before. Sheriff Morales stood on the station's concrete steps, watching her breath curl in the air, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had long gone bitter. She replayed the drifter's words in her head, every pause and tremor, every slip of guilt that surfaced when he described seeing Leah's unmoving body among the undergrowth. He had not killed her, but had abandoned her. That cowardice had carved its own deep wound in the case. Morales rubbed her eyes and went back inside, determined not to let that be the final word. She had a lead, as fragile as it was. She called Ranger Caleb Barnes and Deputy Shaw in early, spreading the old maps across her cluttered desk, her finger tapping on the areas the drifter had described. They needed to find the spot to see what the floodwaters and storms might have buried or washed away. Barnes loaded his gear with the deliberate care of someone preparing for an unpleasant task. He did not speak much, but the lines in his face seemed to deepen with every mile they drove. They parked at an unmarked turnoff, where the brush clawed at the doors as they opened. Shaw checked his GPS and coordinates, while Barnes studied the lay of the land with the practiced eye of a man who knew its secrets. The searchers moved quietly, calling Leah's name less, now their voices hushed, as if they felt the woods listening. Every snapped twig made them turn eyes scanning for shapes in the shadows. The undergrowth was thick damp from recent rains and tangled with thorns that caught at pant legs and scratched cold lines onto exposed wrists. They found the drifters' old campsite by late morning. The remnants were pitiful. A ring of blackened stones for a fire, a crushed can, a stained tarp half buried under leaves. Barnes knelt and lifted a corner with his gloved hand, grimacing at the smell. Shaw scanned the area, noting the patterns in the soil that suggested someone had been there a while, but had moved on in haste. They found an old sock, a rusted spoon, and beneath a pile of wet leaves, something that made Barnes freeze. It was a scarf, faded and stained dark in places where blood had soaked the fibers. He lifted it slowly, holding it up for Shaw to see. The color matched one Leah had worn in the photos they had passed around town. Shaw's throat worked as he swallowed hard and bagged it for evidence. Morales arrived soon after, her boots crunching over the frost-hardened soil. She said nothing at first, only stared at the scarf in its plastic bag. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, rough at the edges. She told them to spread out carefully, to search every inch. She did not want them to miss even a scrap. The deputies worked methodically, scouring the ground for more signs, marking spots with bright tape. The woods felt even more claustrophobic under the pale sun, the bare branches weaving a cage overhead. They moved slowly, avoiding careless steps that could bury evidence further. The silence pressed on them, broken only by their breathing and the occasional call over the radios confirming another useless find. Then Barnes called them over in a voice that left no room for doubt. He stood over a shallow depression in the soil, the edges marked by unnatural lines. The dirt was loose in a way that did not match the surrounding forest floor. Shaw knelt and brushed away a layer of old leaves, revealing the distinct shape of disturbed ground, as if someone had tried to disguise it in a hurry. Morales exhaled slowly and told them to stop. She called in the crime scene unit from the state, her voice tight as she relayed coordinates and conditions. While they waited, the team stood in a rough circle, staring at the ground, the weight of what they had found pressing on their shoulders. They kept the site secure as the specialists arrived in marked trucks, the doors slamming with finality. The crime scene team worked with careful, respectful hands, using small trowels and brushes to peel away the layers of earth. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if the ground itself fought to hold its secrets. Shaw watched with unblinking eyes as fragments of cloth emerged bright against the brown soil. Morales did not speak, except to confirm details over the radio. The process took hours, the sun crossing its zenith and beginning to fall again while they worked in the chill shadow of the trees. When they finally stopped, there was no question left. The evidence was grim and clear. Blood-stained fabric, tangled hair, skeletal remains that even in their ruined state spoke of violence. Shaw turned away, swallowing bile, while Barnes removed his hat and held it in shaking hands. Morales felt tears sting her eyes, but forced them back. She approached the edge of the shallow grave, looking down at the broken promise of a life stolen in these silent woods. She ordered photos, documentation, chain of custody procedures in the same calm, professional voice she had used all her career, though her heart beat a savage rhythm in her chest. Tom Hayes waited at the station that night, hands clasped between his knees, staring at the floor without seeing it. When Morales returned, she sat across from him and told him in measured words that they had found his daughter. She did not dress it up or lie. She told him they had confirmed it was Leah, and that the evidence suggested she had died violently, that this had never been an accident or a case of simply getting lost. Tom listened without moving at first, then leaned forward and let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a curse. He did not ask for details. He only asked if they would find who had done it. Morales reached across the desk and squeezed his hand, promising that they would not stop until they had answers. The morning after Leah's remains were recovered dawned quiet and grim. Sheriff Morales sat in her cramped office, staring at the paperwork spread before her like a map of failure. Every report, every interview, every bit of evidence marked a point on a terrible path that led to one place. Leah Hayes had not wandered off. She had not fallen. She had been murdered. Morales rubbed her temples, slowly, trying to find the focus to keep going. Outside the window, fog clung to the trees, turning the world pale and indistinct, as if even the land wanted to hide from what had happened. She picked up the radio and called her deputies in, with a flat voice that held no room for argument. They had one more job to do. Deputy Shaw arrived first, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something harder. He nodded at Morales without speaking, and began reviewing the files on the table. Ranger Caleb Barnes followed with slow steps, his uniform still damp from the fieldwork the day before. He held his hat in his hands as if unsure what to do with it. Morales looked at them both and began talking without preamble. They had evidence Leah was followed. They had photos showing a man in camouflage tracking her near Klingman's dome. They had her belongings scattered in deliberate cruelty across the landscape. They had initials carved into the old fire tower, and they had her blood on the ground and under her fingernails. Morales told them the lab had come back with a match. The DNA under Leah's nails was not Mason Holt's. It belonged to Paul Rickard. He was a local volunteer who had joined the search early, offering to help map routes and clear brush. He was the quiet man who carried gear and handed out coffee, who had stood beside Tom Hayes and patted his shoulder in false comfort. Morales let the words hang in the room, heavy as stone. Shaw swore under his breath, and Barnes lowered his head, eyes closed tight. No one wanted to believe it, but there it was. Science did not lie. Leah had fought him. She had fought so hard that she carried the truth under her nails, even after everything else was taken from her. They planned the arrest with cold precision. Rickard was at his small house outside Bryson City, a lopsided old place he had inherited from his father. Morales insisted they go in fast and silent. No warning, no chance to run. When they arrived before dawn, they found him drinking coffee on the porch as if nothing had happened. He raised a hand in greeting. Morales did not respond. She read the warrant in a clear voice while Shaw and Barnes flanked him. He blinked at them at first, confused, and then his face changed. It hardened into something cold and flat. He did not resist when they cuffed him. He only said they had it all wrong. He only said Leah should not have been alone out there. In the interview room, Morales faced Rickard across the scarred table. She laid the evidence out, piece by piece. The photos of Leah smiling on the trail, the boot hanging in the fire tower, the burned fragment of her jacket, the SD card with the image of a man in camouflage, his initials carved into the wood, the DNA match under Leah's fingernails. Rickard watched with cold eyes. He spoke slowly, in a voice that never wavered. He admitted seeing her. He admitted following her for a while. He said she looked too confident, too sure of herself. He claimed she needed to be reminded that these woods were not safe. Morales listened to every word, fury burning in her chest. She pressed him harder, asking what he had done. He looked at her calmly and said she fought. She scratched. She made it hard. So he had to finish it. Outside the room, Tom Hayes waited with the same blank stare he had worn for days. When Morales finally came out, she told him quietly, it was over. They had their man. He listened without moving at first, then asked if she was sure. Morales said she was. Tom nodded once. He did not cry. He did not shout. He just sat back against the wall and closed his eyes. She sat beside him in silence. Around them, the station hummed with quiet, purposeful movement. Deputies filing reports, radios crackling, phones ringing with the dull persistence of the world moving on. Tom felt none of it. He was adrift in memory, hearing Leah's voice from the last video she had sent, telling him she was safe, promising she would be careful. The trial that followed was grim and unrelenting. Prosecutors laid out every awful detail. The search grids, the evidence markers, the blood-stained scarf, the SD card with the final images, Leah's fingernails saving the truth no matter how hard the rain fell. Rickard sat through it all with the same flat expression. He did not deny it. He did not show remorse. When asked why he did it, he said the same chilling words, "No woman should wander out here alone." The jury did not take long. They returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. Murder, kidnapping, assault. The judge's voice was low and firm as he sentenced Rickard to life without parole. Tom Hayes sat in the front row every day, eyes hollow but steady. When it was over, Tom did not celebrate. He did not thank the crowd of reporters who tried to swarm him. He walked out into the gray light of an autumn morning and drove slowly back to Bryson City. A week later, the town held a memorial service on a ridge overlooking Deep Creek, where Leah had loved to hike. Friends and family gathered around a simple wooden plaque installed by volunteers. It read, "In memory of Leah Hayes, 1995. Tutwenu? May all who wander here find peace." Tom stood before it with shaking hands, resting on the top edge. He read the words aloud, once voice cracking. Then he turned to the small crowd and began to speak. He talked about Leah as a girl with scraped knees and bright eyes who loved to chase fireflies on summer nights. He talked about the teenager who carried her camera everywhere, capturing every sunrise and every moment of quiet beauty. He spoke about the woman who had loved these mountains so fiercely she wanted to share them with the world. He told them she was not foolish for walking alone. She was brave. She was strong. She deserved the freedom to wander these woods without fear. He thanked the searchers, the deputies, the rangers who had not given up. He thanked Morales, whose voice trembled when she replied that she was just doing her job. At the end, Tom laid a small framed photo at the base of the plaque. It showed Leah smiling against a backdrop of autumn leaf, the camera strap around her neck. The wind picked up gently, rustling the grass and carrying the scent of pine. The people gathered there bowed their heads in silence. They felt the weight of what had been lost, but also the fragile hope that maybe in remembering they could make things different. Tom turned and looked one last time at the mountains Leah had loved. He whispered a promise that he would visit often, that he would not let her name be forgotten. Then he walked slowly back to his truck, his boots crunching in the gravel, his shoulders straight. He drove away as the sun broke through the clouds, turning the ridges gold. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more content like this. We would love to hear what you think about the plot and where you are watching from, so share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us keep telling these stories.